A small island sits in the Bay of Bengal, covered in thick green forest, ringed by pale sand, and surrounded by reefs that make the shoreline hard to reach. From a distance, it can look calm, almost inviting. The trees stand close together, the water shines in the heat, seabirds pass overhead. Yet for a very long time, that peaceful image has hidden one of the most consistent refusals in human history. Boats have approached, officials have tried to land, gifts have been left on the beach. Helicopters have hovered above the trees. In each case, the answer from the island has often been the same: stay away. Before we go deeper, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy long, quiet history like this, and tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what hour it is where you are. I always like imagining these stories, traveling through different rooms, different countries, and different time zones, while the past keeps its own silence. North Sentinel Island is part of the Andaman archipelago, but it has never entered the modern world in the way most places eventually do. It has no port, no roads, no written record from its own people, and no public voice explaining what it wants. Almost everything known about it comes from those who tried to approach from outside, and from the patterns those outsiders noticed before being forced back. That makes the island unusual in a way that is hard to overstate. Many remote places were once poorly known. Many island communities spent centuries at the edges of larger empires. But North Sentinel Island did not merely remain hard to reach, it remained guarded. That distinction matters. A place can be isolated because it is distant, or because the sea around it is dangerous, or because larger powers have little reason to bother with it. North Sentinel Island seems to have had all of those protections at one time or another, but isolation by itself does not fully explain what happened there. Outsiders did not simply fail to notice the island. They did notice it. They mapped it. They named it. They returned to it. They made repeated efforts to close the distance. Still, the island did not open. The people living there answered the approach itself as a threat. That is where the deeper question begins. Why has this resistance lasted so long? Why has the boundary held, not for a generation or two, but across what may be many thousands of years of separation? It is tempting to search for one clean answer. Perhaps the island was just too hard to land on. Perhaps the people were simply more hostile than their neighbors. Perhaps they had good reason to fear disease. Perhaps they had seen what happened to nearby groups after contact and learned the lesson early. All of those ideas contain some truth. None is complete on its own. When people first hear about North Sentinel Island, the story often arrives in fragments. A photograph of men on a beach with bows, a passing mention of one of the last uncontacted peoples on Earth, a headline about a missionary killed after trying to land, a warning that the Indian government bans travel to the island. Those fragments can make the place seem almost unreal, as if it belongs more to myth than to geography. Yet North Sentinel Island is not a legend. It is a real island with real people living on it, and the pattern of refusal is not a romantic mystery invented by outsiders. It is something shown again and again in the historical record of contact attempts. Even the basic act of getting close is difficult. The waters around the island are shallow in places and broken by coral reefs. Large vessels cannot easily move straight to shore. Boats must slow down. That gives anyone watching from land time to prepare. A coastline like that acts almost like an alarm system built by nature. It prevents sudden arrival. It forces approach into a narrow, visible process. Anyone intending to land becomes exposed well before stepping onto the beach. On a defended island, that matters enormously. The forest adds another layer. Dense tropical vegetation can hide movement from a distance, conceal settlements from direct view, and make it hard for visitors to know what lies a short distance inland. An outsider standing on the beach may think he is looking at empty trees. In reality, he may be watched from several positions at once. For people who know the paths, the sounds, the ground, and the timing of tides, the island offers advantages that strangers cannot quickly overcome. A shoreline is never just a shoreline when one side knows it better than the other. It becomes a line of control. That helps explain why North Sentinel Island has often seemed to outsiders both visible and inaccessible at the same time. The island is there. Maps can place it. Satellites can see it. Boats can circle near it in fair weather. Yet actually crossing the last stretch, the short distance between water and land, is where the problem begins. Many of the island's most famous moments are really stories about that last stretch. A gift boat hesitates. Men appear with weapons. A landing party backs away. A helicopter drops supplies but cannot safely remain. The island does not have to chase the outside world. It only has to defend the edge. One of the earliest modern layers of this story comes from the age of British imperial expansion in the Andaman Islands. By the 19th century, the British were taking increasing interest in the region, especially as a site for penal colonies and strategic control. Once an empire begins building prisons, roads, supply stations, and administrative networks in an island chain, unknown neighboring communities rarely remain unknown for long. Officials, surveyors, and naval personnel become curious. They want coastlines measured, populations classified, and routes understood. North Sentinel Island entered that field of vision because empire does not like blanks on maps. The problem for the British was that noticing a people is not the same as reaching them. Accounts from the colonial period describe attempts to approach the island, but these efforts did not produce anything like stable contact. Landing parties found traces of habitation at times, such as huts or paths, yet the inhabitants themselves often withdrew into the forest or appeared only on terms that made approach impossible. The pattern was already recognizable. The islanders were not presenting themselves for trade or conversation. They were keeping distance and controlling exposure. A figure often mentioned in this history is Maurice Vidal Portman, a colonial officer who became deeply involved in efforts to make contact with Andaman peoples in the late 19th century. Portman is remembered partly because his methods reveal the mindset of empire in unusually clear form. He did not approach these communities as societies with a right to remain separate. He approached them as subjects to be studied, classified, and brought into colonial knowledge. On North Sentinel, as elsewhere in the Andamans, that mindset led to acts that now feel deeply disturbing. Portman and his men are said to have landed on the island during one expedition, found abandoned villages, and eventually captured several islanders, including elderly adults and children, carrying them away to Port Blair. The older people reportedly became ill and died soon after. The children were later returned with gifts. Even if one knew nothing else about the later history of North Sentinel Island, that single episode would explain a great deal. Imagine what such an encounter meant from the islanders' point of view. Strangers arrive from the sea. They seize people and remove them. Those taken away die. The children come back, carrying the touch of the outside world. That is not contact in any peaceful sense. It is trauma. It is easy, from the distance of modern reading, to flatten such a moment into one more colonial anecdote. But on a small island community, where memory may pass not through books but through repeated telling and warning, a single violent or deadly encounter can shape behavior for generations. The lesson would not need to be written down to endure. The sea brings danger. Unknown people carry sickness. Taking gifts can lead to death. Being near outsiders can mean disappearance. Under those conditions, hostility is not irrational, it is protective. And yet, even this is not enough on its own. Other indigenous groups elsewhere suffered kidnappings, disease, and violence, but did not remain as completely unreachable as the Sentinelese appear to have done. So the question sharpens. If colonial cruelty explains part of the refusal, what allowed this refusal to remain effective? Why were they able to preserve distance when so many others were swallowed by larger systems of trade, mission activity, administration, or forced settlement? The answer begins to form when we look not only at motive, but at practicality. Refusal works only if it can be enforced. A small community facing a large state cannot simply wish the state away. But North Sentinel Island had several advantages that made enforcement possible. It was not a fertile inland kingdom that outsiders could march into with cavalry or roads. It was a compact island, buffered by reefs, watched from shore, and of limited obvious economic value. There were no known mineral riches there, no large harbor worth turning into a major naval base, no population large enough to tax in any meaningful sense. The island lay close enough to imperial power to be noticed, but not important enough to justify an overwhelming conquest. That middle condition matters. It meant pressure without total absorption. The outside world also faced a problem of patience. To break the island's autonomy would have required sustained, organized force and a willingness to bear logistical difficulty for little practical reward. Empires can be brutally persistent when there is profit, military advantage, settlement potential, or symbolic value at stake. North Sentinel Island offered very little of that. So the encounters remained intermittent. That gave the islanders time between approaches, time to restore distance, time to make each new landing costly or uncertain. In history, survival often depends not only on courage, but on the enemy's limited interest. As the 20th century moved on, and decolonization changed the political map, North Sentinel Island entered a new phase. British rule ended. India became the governing power in the Andamans. One might imagine this shift bringing a softer approach, and in some ways it did. The language of administration changed. So did the formal goals. Yet the deeper assumption often remained familiar. The Sentinelese were a people to be reached, studied, protected, or brought into some kind of managed relationship with the state. The methods were not always as openly violent as Portman's, but they were still rooted in outside control. By the later 20th century, Indian officials and anthropologists organized expeditions intended to establish friendlier contact. Boats approached the island carrying coconuts, metal tools, and other offerings. Sometimes these were left in the shallows or on the beach. Sometimes the hope was that repeated visits would slowly reduce fear and create a pattern of acceptance. There were moments that seemed, from the outside, mildly encouraging. On a few occasions, islanders came close enough to inspect gifts. At times, they appeared less immediately aggressive than in earlier encounters. To hopeful observers, this suggested progress. But progress can be misread when the observers want it badly enough. Accepting or inspecting gifts does not mean accepting a relationship. Curiosity is not trust. Temporary restraint is not surrender. Reports from these expeditions often moved in an uncertain rhythm. Approach, tension, symbolic offering, retreat. Outsiders returned from some visits, believing that a fragile bridge might be forming. Yet the bridge never held. The basic condition remained the same. The islanders controlled contact, and they could reject it at any moment. There is something revealing in the way gifts were used. Coconuts became famous because they do not naturally grow on North Sentinel Island in abundance, so they were treated as attractive foreign objects. easy to float ashore, and easy to observe from a boat. But gifts carry different meanings depending on the world receiving them. To a state or an anthropologist, a gift may be a first gesture of peace. To a small island society with a long memory of abduction and disease, it may be bait, a test, or simply a useful object detached from any larger relationship. The same coconut can be read in two entirely different ways. Outsiders often mistook use for consent. Some of the most striking images from the late 20th century show Sentinelese men standing on the beach with bows, watching approaching boats. The scene contains almost everything important about the island in a single frame. They are not hidden deep inland by accident. They are at the shore, alert, positioned where first contact happens. The weapons are not random ornaments. They are part of a practiced response. Their stance is not one of wild confusion at seeing strangers. It is controlled, deliberate, and territorial. That suggests repetition. This has happened before. They know what to do. Even the emotional language used by outsiders can mislead. North Sentinel Island is often described as hostile, savage, violent, or fiercely isolated. Such words may describe the result, but they do not explain the logic behind it. A community can appear aggressive because aggression is the cheapest and clearest defense available. A warning arrow does not require translation. A drawn bow does not depend on shared language. On a beach where both sides know almost nothing about each other, visible readiness to fight may be the only reliable way to stop a landing before it begins. When the Indian government's contact missions continued into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they produced a history full of small, dramatic moments, rather than a stable turning point. Officials approached. Islanders responded. Sometimes they shouted. Sometimes they displayed weapons. Sometimes they kept greater distance. The island did not move toward regular exchange, schooling, mission stations, markets, or negotiated treaties. It remained itself. That may sound simple, but in the modern world it is an extraordinary outcome. Most frontiers do not stay frontiers once states become interested in them. Then came one of the most revealing moments of all, not because it was planned, but because it happened during disaster. After the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, there was concern across the region about remote island populations. Entire coastlines had been destroyed elsewhere. Relief authorities needed to know whether the Sentinelese had survived. A helicopter was sent to check on the island. From a humanitarian perspective, the impulse made sense. A giant wave had swept through the ocean basin. Surely any small coastal society might need help. What happened next was completely consistent with the older pattern. The helicopter approached, and the islanders responded with hostility, reportedly firing arrows or otherwise driving it away. To the outside world, this could seem astonishing. After a natural disaster, should aid not be welcome? But that reaction reveals more about outside assumptions than about the Sentinelese. Help is only help if it is recognized as such. A machine descending from the sky, after generations of danger arriving from beyond the horizon, may not look like rescue. It may look like the same old threat in a louder form. That post-tsunami moment matters because it showed the depth of continuity. This was not just inherited fear from colonial times fading slowly into memory. It was an active system of defense still functioning in the 21st century. Whatever damage the tsunami may or may not have caused, the community remained organized enough to observe the aircraft, respond quickly, and reject intrusion. The island had not drifted open under modern pressure. The boundary still held. The most widely known recent event connected to North Sentinel Island came in 2018 when John Allen Chau, an American missionary, attempted to land on the island in hopes of preaching Christianity to its inhabitants. He traveled illegally, used local fishermen to approach the protected zone, and tried several times to make contact. According to reports reconstructed from his writings and from the accounts of those who helped transport him, he knew the risks. He believed his mission overrode them. He was killed soon after landing. That event drew worldwide attention, partly because it condensed the entire history of outside approach into one modern tragedy. A lone man, convinced he carried truth and salvation, tried to cross a boundary that had been defended for generations. He brought words the island had never asked for, and assumed that intention could cancel history. It could not. His death shocked many people, yet in another sense it changed nothing. It confirmed the same pattern seen for more than a century. North Sentinel Island remained closed because those on the island intended it to remain closed. There is a tendency, especially in popular reporting, to treat the Chow story as the essential North Sentinel narrative, but that narrows the history too much. His death was not the beginning of the conflict between the island and the outside world. It was a late episode in a much older sequence. If anything, it showed how little the basic equation has changed. Outsiders still imagine that approach can succeed if framed morally, spiritually, scientifically, or humanely. The islanders still answer from within a different logic, one that treats the outsider's purpose as irrelevant beside the fact of intrusion itself. By now, one pattern should be clear. North Sentinel Island did not remain separate because nobody found it. It remained separate because approach was repeatedly detected, interpreted as a threat, and opposed. Geography helped make that possible. History supplied reasons. Political circumstance limited the willingness of stronger powers to force the issue completely, but resistance itself was active. The island was not merely left alone by fortune, it was defended. Still, that leaves an even more difficult question waiting just beneath the surface. Resistance can explain how a boundary is maintained in the short term, but how does it become so durable? How does a community sustain the will, the discipline, and the social memory needed to reject the outside world again and again over what may be an immense span of time? Such continuity suggests more than fear. It suggests a way of life in which contact offers very little benefit and enormous risk. For that to be true, the islanders must have had enough within their own world to make refusal workable. That is where the story widens. The beach confrontations are the visible edge, but they are only the edge. Behind them lies a deeper history, where the Sentinelese came from, how long they may have been in the Andamans, what the sea protected them from, and why nearby peoples followed different paths. The arrows on the shore tell us that outsiders were not wanted. They do not yet tell us how such refusal became one of the most successful acts of human separation in recorded history. And once that deeper history comes into view, the island begins to look less like a simple story of hostility and more like a story of survival under very precise conditions. Not survival in the dramatic sense of one desperate battle, but survival as continuity, the kind measured in generations. A people remains on its land, its language continues. Its children learn where the reef breaks, where the fish move, where strangers come from, and what must be done when they appear. The world around them changes beyond recognition. Empires rise and fall. Ships become aircraft. Colonial officers become protected area regulations. Yet the shoreline answer remains almost unchanged. So the real mystery is not why one boat was turned back, or why one missionary died, or why one helicopter met arrows after a tsunami. The real mystery is how an island society preserved enough control over its own border for those moments to keep happening at all. And that question takes us far beyond the modern encounters and into the older human story of the Andaman Islands, where the roots of this long refusal seem to reach much deeper than any one empire, any one expedition, or any one failed landing. Long before North Sentinel Island appeared on colonial maps, before passing ships tried to name it, before governments marked it as restricted water, the Andaman Islands were already part of a much older human story. To understand why the Sentinelese resisted the outside world so consistently, it helps to step back from the dramatic shoreline encounters and look at a quieter question. How long have the people of that island been there, living within that ring of reef and forest, carrying forward a way of life that may reach into very deep time? No one can answer that with perfect certainty. The Sentinelese do not leave written chronicles. Archaeologists cannot simply dig across the island as they might elsewhere, because contact is forbidden and disturbance would be both dangerous and unethical. Linguists know almost nothing of the Sentinelese language beyond the fact that it is not mutually understood by neighboring groups who have had limited contact with outsiders. So the past of North Sentinel Island has to be reconstructed indirectly through the broader history of the Andaman Islands, through genetics gathered from related indigenous groups, through geography, and through the logic of migration in the ancient Indian Ocean world. That indirect method is frustrating if one wants a clean date and a neat answer. But it is also revealing because it shows how unusual the Sentinelese case really is. The strongest evidence suggests that the indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands descend from very ancient human populations, and that their presence in these islands may go back many thousands of years, possibly far deeper than most modern listeners first imagine. In broad terms, the Andamanese world may preserve traces of some of the earliest human movements through coastal South and Southeast Asia. To picture that, it helps to leave behind the modern map for a moment. Today, the Bay of Bengal looks like a large sea enclosed by the Indian subcontinent to the west, Southeast Asia to the east, and the Andaman and Nicobar island chains stretching down toward Indonesia. But during the late Pleistocene, sea levels were often much lower than they are now because so much of Earth's water was locked up in ice. Lower sea levels changed coastlines everywhere. Continental shelves that are now submerged once lay exposed. Distances between islands and mainlands could shrink. Some islands that now seem isolated may have been easier to approach, whether by short crossings, hopping routes, or coast-hugging movement. Modern humans are believed to have spread out of Africa in deep prehistory and moved along multiple routes into South Asia, Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia and beyond. One long debated possibility is that some of these early populations traveled partly along coastal corridors. Whether every detail of that model is correct remains disputed, but what matters here is that the Andaman Islands sit in a region touched by very ancient human dispersal. They are not remote in the sense of being outside human movement altogether. They are remote in the sense of preserving old separation once those movements settled into place. The indigenous peoples of the Andamans have often been grouped together under broad labels by outsiders, but historically, they were not one single society. They included multiple groups with different territories, languages, and social patterns. Among the best known are the Great Andamanese, the Ong, the Jarawa, and the Sentinelese. These communities lived across different islands or parts of islands, and though outsiders often flattened them into one category, their histories did not unfold in the same way. That matters because the Sentinelese were not simply the Andamanese. They were one branch of a wider indigenous world, shaped by both shared ancestry and deep local difference. This is where the question of time becomes more delicate. When people say the Sentinelese have been isolated for thousands of years, that can mean several different things. It might mean their ancestors have lived in the Andaman region for a very long time. It might mean their own community has remained distinct from neighboring populations for a long time. Or it might mean they have had no significant sustained contact with the outside world for a long time. These are related but not identical claims. A people can be ancient in a region without having remained fully separate from all neighbors. They can be culturally distinct without being genetically sealed off. They can avoid sustained foreign contact while still having occasional inter-island encounters. The real picture is almost certainly more layered than the simplest version. Even so, the general direction is hard to miss. The Andaman Islands have sheltered indigenous communities whose roots appear very old. Studies of related groups have often pointed toward long-term separation from surrounding mainland populations. Physical anthropology once tried, often badly and with crude categories, to fit the Andamanese into racial schemes that said more about European obsession than about the people being studied. Much of that older language is now rejected, but beneath the bad science, there was one accurate underlying recognition. These island populations had a very long independent history. Modern genetics has helped refine that picture, even though there are strict limits. Because the Sentinelese themselves have not been sampled directly, most insight comes from studies of other Andaman groups, especially the Ong and Great Andamanese, whose histories have unfortunately been shaped by devastating contact, displacement, and demographic collapse. Such studies do not provide a simple stand-in for the Sentinelese, but they do suggest that the Andamanese world includes lineages that separated from other Eurasian populations very long ago. That does not mean the Sentinelese are a living fossil, as sensational writing sometimes implies. No human group is frozen in time. It means only that their ancestors have been part of a very old human branch in this region, and that long isolation can preserve genetic distinctions. Yet genetics alone cannot tell the whole story, because a people is not just ancestry. Culture, language, memory, and territory also shape isolation. In the case of North Sentinel Island, geography almost certainly turned old separation into something more durable. The island lies west of South Andaman Island, but it is not so close that ordinary casual traffic would be inevitable. The surrounding reef makes approach difficult, especially for larger craft, or for those unfamiliar with the waters. The island is not large, but it is large enough to support a small foraging population when combined with marine resources. In other words, it sits in a useful middle ground, close enough to a wider island world to be part of the Andaman human story, but protected enough to sustain local independence. It is possible that the ancestors of the Sentinelese were once more connected to nearby populations than they later became. Human groups rarely spring into being as complete isolates from the very first day of settlement. More often, separation deepens over time. A branch population moves, settles, reduces exchange, adapts to local terrain, develops a more distinct language, and gradually becomes harder to fold back into a larger network. That kind of process would make sense in the Andamans. If a small group settled North Sentinel long ago, the island's reef barrier and self-sufficient resource base could have encouraged increasing autonomy generation after generation. The question then becomes, not only how they got there, but how they stayed there. Survival on a small island is never automatic. Isolation can protect, but it can also trap. A population that is too small can struggle with environmental shocks, demographic instability, storms, injuries, or shortages of mates. For a community to persist over the long term, the island must provide enough food, enough fresh water, enough shelter, and enough room to reproduce social life. North Sentinel Island appears to have offered these things at least well enough to sustain continuity. Its forests, beaches, shallow waters, and surrounding reefs likely provided fish, turtles, birds, wild plants, and other resources that could support a relatively small population without farming on a large, settled scale. That detail matters more than it may seem. Many populations become dependent on outsiders because their local resource base is too narrow to support long autonomy. They need trade for metals, tools, food security, marriage networks, or ritual exchange. If the Sentinelese world remained viable without those dependencies, then separation became practical rather than merely symbolic. Refusal is easier when you do not need what lies beyond the reef. The Andaman environment also shaped the broader history around them. Dense forests, heavy rainfall, coastal complexity, disease environments unfamiliar to outsiders, and difficult navigation all made the islands a challenging place for sustained interference before the era of modern administration. Mainland powers did not casually settle them in large numbers over thousands of years. They were noticed, approached, feared, and sometimes raided, but not absorbed in the way many more accessible coastal zones were. That wider regional pattern gave island communities space to remain themselves for long periods. There are hints in older travel accounts that outside sailors knew of dangerous or unfriendly islanders in the Andaman region long before formal colonial rule. Medieval and early modern seafarers crossing the Bay of Bengal were aware that these islands existed, and some accounts describe inhabitants in exaggerated or fantastical terms. Such descriptions are unreliable in detail, often shaped by fear and rumor, but they still suggest something important. Outsiders did not move through these waters in calm intimacy with every island they passed. Parts of the Andamans already carried a reputation for hostility, danger, or avoidance. That reputation may itself have helped preserve distance. Still, one should be careful not to treat all old accounts as clear references to the Sentinelese specifically. Sailors often spoke loosely, merged stories from different islands, and repeated hearsay. The Bay of Bengal was full of uncertainty for long-distance travelers. Storms, reefs, currents, and imperfect charts made many coastlines feel threatening. So while the older reputation of the Andaman supports the idea of long-term separation, it cannot by itself prove an unbroken direct line of hostile contact with North Sentinel Island over millennia. What does seem more probable is that the island's people remained outside any large, durable network of trade or state control for a very long time. In world history, that alone is rare. Most coastlines eventually become threaded into exchange systems. Goods move, languages mix, marriage ties spread, religious ideas travel. But for that to happen, both geography and social willingness have to allow it. North Sentinel appears to have resisted on both fronts. The reef complicated arrival, and the inhabitants themselves seem to have enforced distance whenever arrival was attempted. One clue to deep separation lies in language, though here again the evidence is thin. The Sentinelese language is poorly known because no real conversation has ever been established. Attempts by speakers of other Andaman languages to communicate have apparently failed or yielded little. That suggests considerable divergence. Languages can split and change rapidly or slowly depending on many factors, so this does not offer a reliable clock by itself. But if neighboring indigenous groups could not simply walk ashore and speak in mutually understood terms, then the Sentinelese were not just a recent splinter that had remained casually connected. Their separation had likely become substantial. And language is not merely a technical detail. It is one of the strongest carriers of social boundaries. A community whose speech is unintelligible to its neighbors does not just sound different. It remembers differently. It passes down instructions, stories, names, warnings, and categories in forms that outsiders cannot enter. If North Sentinel Island preserved a distinct language over a very long period, then it preserved an entire mental world. That makes resistance to contact easier, because outside speech arrives not as a bridge, but as noise tied to danger. There is another reason scholars speak cautiously about the length of Sentinelese isolation. Isolation is rarely absolute. Even a fiercely independent island community might have had rare encounters with nearby peoples in the distant past, whether conflict, exchange, intermarriage, or mutual observation at sea. The problem is that the evidence is almost silent. We cannot assume total uninterrupted solitude in the romantic sense. Human history is usually messier than that. But nor can we dismiss the strong possibility of very deep practical separation simply because absolute purity is impossible to prove. The more responsible conclusion is that the Sentinelese probably belong to an ancient regional human presence and have maintained unusually strong autonomy for a very long time, perhaps over thousands of years. What would that look like in ordinary life? It would mean children growing up in a world where the boundaries of the island were part of basic knowledge, just as the seasons, the fish runs, and the shape of the shore were basic knowledge. It would mean that tools, hunting practices, shelter forms, and social habits were adapted to a local environment rather than borrowed from an expanding outside economy. It would mean that identity was tied not to an abstract nation or a written origin story, but to repeated life in a place whose dangers and gifts were intimately known. In such a world, the outside is not a neutral option waiting to be sampled. It is simply outside. That perspective can be hard for modern societies to grasp because the modern world treats connection as a default good. Roads, trade, schools, medicine, religion, technology, and communication are often framed as obvious benefits that any isolated group would eventually want if only trust could be built. But that assumption comes from within a world already dependent on those systems. A small island society whose knowledge is fitted to its own ecology may not see contact as expansion. It may see it, quite correctly, as destabilization. The longer a group has persisted without outside integration, the more risky outside integration may appear. This is where deep time changes the emotional meaning of North Sentinel Island. If the Sentinelese had merely hidden for a few centuries after one traumatic event, their hostility might be read as temporary fear. But if their society belongs to a much older pattern of guarded independence, then resistance is not just reaction, it is structure. It is part of how the community has continued to exist. The ancientness of their presence in the region, even if imprecisely measured, gives weight to the idea that separation is not an accident or delay. It is a successful historical strategy. And yet the story grows more complicated when we remember that not all Andaman groups followed the same path. The great Andamanese were drawn catastrophically into colonial contact. The Anj were reduced and reshaped under outside pressure. The Jarawa, though long resistant, eventually entered a more regular and damaging relationship with the outside world through encroachment, roads, disease, and tourism. If these neighboring peoples shared deep regional roots, why did North Sentinel remain the exception? Part of the answer may lie in simple geography. North Sentinel is an island off an island. That extra degree of separation matters. Groups on larger islands, especially those nearer colonial stations, could be approached overland, tracked more easily, or pressured repeatedly. The Sentinelese lived behind water. Water can be crossed, of course, but it slows domination. It narrows routes. It favors defenders who know reefs and currents. A colonial force could raid the island or circle it, but it could not casually move inland and remain there without planning, resupply, and risk. Part may also lie in demography and political luck. Some indigenous groups were devastated because colonizers needed their lands directly, or because settlement, prisons, roads, and military bases spread into their territory. North Sentinel escaped the worst of that because outsiders never found enough reason to occupy it intensively. It was noticed, but not transformed into a central project. That sounds like luck because in part it was. History often preserves one community and destroys another, not because one is morally stronger, but because the pressures fall unevenly. Still, luck alone is not satisfying as an explanation. The Sentinelese were not passive beneficiaries of being overlooked. They enforced their good fortune. If the island's people had welcomed traders, missionaries, convicts, shipwreck survivors, or administrative stations, geography alone would not have saved them. Their own behavior mattered. Over time, geography and behavior likely strengthened each other. The harder the island was to approach, the easier it was to defend. The more consistently it was defended, the less tempting long-term penetration became. That feedback loop may be one of the hidden keys to their longevity. One can imagine moments across many generations when the continuation of separation depended on choices that felt ordinary to the people making them. A canoe spotted near the reef, a stranger glimpsed on shore, a remembered warning repeated to the young, a decision not to accept a landing, not to invite exchange, not to let curiosity become dependence. None of these moments would look grand from inside the community. Yet, across centuries, they might accumulate into one of the most durable frontiers on Earth. This is also why the Sentinelese should not be imagined as relics outside history. They are in history very deeply. They have endured storms, shifting sea levels, neighboring changes, passing ships, colonial violence, and the approach of modern states. Their resistance is not proof that nothing ever happened to them. It is proof that many things happened around them, and that they navigated those pressures without being absorbed. Isolation, in their case, is not stillness. It is work. Archaeology would surely enrich this story if it could be conducted, but the absence of excavation also teaches something. Modern knowledge does not have automatic rights over every place. North Sentinel Island remains one of the rare sites where the refusal of a people still outweighs the curiosity of science. That frustrates historians, anthropologists, and journalists, but it also preserves a moral boundary. We know less because to know more by force would repeat the older pattern of intrusion. The very scarcity of evidence is part of the historical condition we are trying to explain. So how long have they been alone? The safest answer is that the Sentinelese likely descend from an ancient human presence in the Andaman Islands, and that their community has probably maintained deep separation for a very long time, perhaps measured in thousands of years rather than merely centuries. But the more interesting answer is not a number. The more interesting answer is that their isolation sits on several layers at once: ancient migration, island geography, ecological sufficiency, cultural continuity, and a repeated willingness to reject the outside. Remove any one layer, and the story may have ended differently. There is a temptation, when facing a people like the Sentinelese, to place them outside ordinary history, as if they exist in a sealed bubble untouched by the passage of time. In truth, their story may reveal the opposite. It shows how history can preserve difference as well as erase it. It shows that the spread of states, trade, religion, and technology has never been perfectly uniform, and it reminds us that deep human time does not belong only to ruins, bones, and buried cities. Sometimes it survives in living boundaries, in a shoreline no outsider can cross without being told no. That makes the next question even sharper. If the Sentinelese share ancient roots with other Andaman peoples, and if those neighboring peoples were eventually pulled into disastrous contact with outsiders, then North Sentinel's history cannot be explained by age alone. Something else happened. Nearby communities were transformed, reduced, or exposed. North Sentinel was not. The contrast is too strong to ignore. Somewhere in that contrast lies one of the clearest clues to why the island's refusal endured while so many other indigenous frontiers fell apart. If North Sentinel Island were the only indigenous society in the Andaman world, its resistance might seem easier to explain. A remote island, difficult reefs, a small population, generations of caution. That would already be enough to make the story striking. But North Sentinel was not alone. Other Andaman peoples lived nearby, shared the same broad region, and faced the same expanding outside world. Their histories did not end the same way. Some were drawn into colonial systems. Some were shattered by disease. Some were forced into dependency. Some resisted for a long time and then lost ground slowly. The Sentinelese remained apart. That contrast matters because it turns the island's story from a simple tale of remoteness into something more revealing. They were not merely hidden. They were different in the way they managed the danger. To see why, it helps to widen the map again. The Andaman Islands were home to multiple indigenous groups, each with its own territory, customs, and language. Outsiders often treated them as a single category because colonial power has a habit of simplifying the peoples it wants to classify. But life in the islands was not organized according to outsider convenience. A people living on one island or in one stretch of forest could have patterns of movement, trade, marriage, or hostility that differed sharply from those of another group a relatively short distance away. That local complexity mattered a great deal once empires and states entered the region, because pressure did not fall evenly. One community might be exposed first, another might be drawn into negotiation, another might endure violent raids, another might be left mostly alone for a time. The great Andamanese are often the first group mentioned in this wider history, and their story is one of the clearest warnings about what contact could do. Before sustained British colonization, the great Andamanese consisted of multiple related groups spread across the larger Andaman Islands. Their numbers were far greater than what survived into the 20th century. Then colonial settlement began to transform the region. Penal colonies, military arrangements, roads, forest clearing, and regular movement of outsiders placed indigenous communities into close and repeated contact with new diseases, new authorities, and new forms of violence. The result was catastrophic. Population collapse followed. Land was lost. The social world that had sustained the great Andamanese for generations broke apart under pressure. This was not unusual in the global history of contact, though that makes it no less terrible. A small population without immunity to outside diseases can be devastated by infections that seem ordinary to those carrying them. Colonial systems also bring dependencies that spread quietly at first. Food is offered. Tools are offered. Medical aid is offered. New routines form. Movement becomes monitored. The older territorial order weakens. Children grow up in a world where the outside is no longer distant, and the community's ability to control boundaries diminishes. Once that process begins, it can be very hard to reverse. For the great Andamanese, the British presence was not a brief disturbance. but a structural change. Colonial rule needed land, labor, and order. Indigenous mobility and territorial autonomy stood in the way of those aims. Contact in such a setting did not mean two equal societies meeting at the shore and deciding what to exchange. It meant one power arriving with administration, punishment, armed force, and disease. Whatever curiosity or accommodation may have existed on particular occasions, the larger balance was overwhelmingly unequal. The result was not cultural enrichment or peaceful merging, it was destruction. The Onge followed a different path in detail, but not in outcome. Living mainly in Little Andaman, they were also drawn into relations with the outside world that profoundly altered their numbers and autonomy. Their population fell sharply. Settlement schemes and welfare-style administration placed them in increasingly managed circumstances. Outside systems claimed to protect them, and at times they did offer food or medical support, but protection often came tied to control. A people who had once lived within their own ecological rhythm were gradually redefined as a vulnerable minority to be handled by the state. That transformation may sound gentler than conquest, but it still carried deep losses: land, independence, health, self-direction, and the ordinary continuity of cultural life. The Jarawa present perhaps the most revealing comparison with the Sentinelese, because for a long time they too were known for fierce resistance. Living on South and Middle Andaman, the Jarawa had a history of hostility toward outsiders and remained outside stable control for much of the colonial period. Like the Sentinelese, they were often described by outsiders through the language of danger. They were seen as archers in the forest, defenders of their territory, people who attacked intruders and resisted settlement. For years, that made them appear to belong to the same pattern as North Sentinel, a community determined to remain beyond the reach of empire and administration. But the similarity had limits, and those limits reveal the importance of geography and exposure. The Jarawa lived on larger islands, where colonial infrastructure and later Indian development could expand into their territory over land. Roads could cut through the forest. Settlers could move closer. Patrols could return again and again. Contact did not depend only on risky boat landings at a defended beach. It could creep forward through encroachment. That changed everything. A people can repel a landing party once. It is much harder to repel a permanent road. The Andaman Trunk Road became one of the most damaging symbols of this process. By cutting through Jarawa territory, it turned outside approach into a routine fact rather than an occasional intrusion. Vehicles, settlers, poachers, and tourists gained access. Disease risk rose. Dependency could be encouraged through food offerings. Contact became not a single event, but a pattern built into infrastructure. Over time, the Jarawa were pushed into increasingly regular interaction with the outside world, often under conditions that outsiders described as helpful or inevitable. In reality, the process exposed them to exploitation and reduced their ability to regulate their own boundaries. This contrast with North Sentinel is crucial. The Jarawa were not less intelligent, less cautious, or less committed to self-preservation. They faced a different structural problem. Their territory was penetrated from within the larger islands around them. Their refusal had to meet roads, settlements, and constant pressure. The Sentinelese faced approach across water. Water buys time. Water creates warning. Water limits casual intrusion. The more one compares the Jarawa and the Sentinelese, the more North Sentinel's continued autonomy appears not as a mystery of character alone, but as a result of the physical form of the frontier itself. Still, structure is not the whole story. If geography explains why the Sentinelese could defend separation more successfully, history may explain why they wanted to defend it so consistently. This is where the experiences of neighboring peoples likely became part of the island's own understanding of danger. It is impossible to know exactly what the Sentinelese saw or heard about the collapse of other Andaman groups, but it would be a mistake to imagine them living in perfect informational darkness. Even highly isolated communities can observe changes in nearby waters, coastlines, and patterns of movement. They can see ships. They can notice the disappearance of familiar neighbors. They can observe strangers using nearby routes more often than before. They can encounter traces washed ashore, hear distant stories through rare indirect contact, or simply recognize that the world beyond the reef is changing in ominous ways. If the Sentinelese had any awareness at all of what sustained outside contact did elsewhere in the Andamans, then their resistance may have become more than inherited suspicion. It may have become informed policy at the level of the community, even if not written or spoken in terms an outsider would recognize as policy. Contact does not have to be discussed in abstract theory to be understood. A people only needs to notice a pattern. Outsiders arrive. Illness follows. Land changes hands. Numbers decline. Dependency grows. Once that pattern is visible, keeping outsiders away is no longer a reflex. It is a strategy. This possibility changes the emotional meaning of their hostility. Outsider accounts often frame refusal as fear, savagery, or blind aggression. But what if it was closer to historical judgment? What if the Sentinelese were not merely recoiling from the unknown, but correctly reading the known? That would not make every act of violence morally simple, but it would make the broader pattern much easier to understand. A people can reject contact because contact, in their world, has a terrible record. The colonial record in the Andamans offers many reasons for such a judgment. The British penal colony at Port Blair created a center of sustained imperial presence. Prisoners, officials, soldiers, laborers, and settlers altered the balance of the islands. Forest resources were extracted. Land was mapped and reordered. Indigenous movements were monitored. Punitive expeditions were launched against groups seen as troublesome. Contact parties sought out island communities, not because those communities had invited relation, but because the colonial system preferred visibility to uncertainty. In such a setting, making contact often meant stripping away the very conditions that had allowed indigenous autonomy to survive. A small island community observing any part of that process would not need a modern theory of colonialism to understand its implications. They would only need to see that proximity to the outsider coincided with danger. That understanding may have been sharpened by the unusual brutality of certain encounters, especially kidnappings and forced removals. When colonial officers captured Andaman Islanders to display, study, or pacify them, they sent a message far beyond the immediate victims. The message was simple: outsiders do not just arrive, they take. Disease would have deepened that lesson. In island societies, demographic collapse can happen so quickly that it acquires a near supernatural quality from the perspective of those living through it. People who were healthy 1 month can be dead the next. Elders vanish, children weaken, ritual life is interrupted, skill and memory disappear with the dead. Outsiders may not even understand the scale of what they have caused, because the diseases they carry do not strike them with equal force. To the receiving community, this asymmetry must feel horrifying. The stranger does not have to attack with weapons to act like a destroyer. He carries death in his body without seeming to notice. That may be one reason the Sentinelese did not follow the same path as other groups, even during the Indian government's later and more carefully staged contact missions. By then, the language of conquest had softened. Anthropologists and administrators often describe their efforts as peaceful, patient, respectful. Coconuts and gifts replaced open kidnapping. There was more attention to minimizing harm. Yet the deeper memory of what outsiders could bring had not vanished, nor had the structural risks. A small community, opening itself to repeated visits, still faced disease, dependency, and eventual loss of control, even if the first boat arrived smiling. This is why some of the apparent friendly contact episodes from the late 20th century should be treated carefully. On a few visits, Sentinelese individuals approached boats more closely, accepted coconuts, or seemed less openly aggressive than before. Outsiders sometimes interpreted those moments as signs that the island was on the edge of a breakthrough. But from a different angle, such moments may simply show tactical curiosity. A people can inspect an outsider without desiring relation. They can test distance. They can take a useful object. None of that means they have forgotten the larger danger. In contrast, once the Jarowaw entered a more regular contact zone, their choices narrowed. Repeated exposure changed the terms. Gifts became dependency. Observation turned into tourism. Outsiders began to treat Jarowaw territory as a passage rather than a boundary. This difference may help explain why the Sentinelese answer to approach remained comparatively clear and forceful. Ambiguity can be dangerous at a frontier. If you want to keep the outsider at a distance, mixed signals invite persistence. A hard refusal, unpleasant as it may appear, has the advantage of clarity. There is also the matter of size and social cohesion. Larger populations spread over wider areas may have more varied responses to outsiders. Some individuals or subgroups may prefer trade, others hostility, others cautious accommodation. Internal divisions can widen under pressure. A very small island community may find it easier to sustain a single collective rule, especially if every member can see the consequences of breach more directly. That does not mean small societies are automatically unified, but it does suggest that North Sentinel's scale may have helped maintain consistency. The community did not need a complex bureaucracy to enforce a border. It needed shared understanding at the shoreline. The material life of the Sentinelese may also have made refusal easier than it was for some neighboring groups. Where communities become drawn into outside networks through metal tools, tobacco, alcohol, cloth, food, or medicine, the practical benefits of contact begin to compete with older caution. This has happened in many parts of the world. At first, the outsider brings one useful thing, then a second, then a habit forms. Soon, refusal becomes harder, because daily life has been altered. The Sentinelese appear to have kept that process from taking hold. They may have used salvaged metal from shipwrecks or drift material when it appeared, but there is no sign that they accepted the outside world as a stable supplier of necessities. That distinction is important. Opportunistic use is not dependence. Some historians and anthropologists have suggested that the Sentinelese may have learned from the fate of other Andaman peoples in a very direct sense, not just through rumor or distant observation, but through occasional rare encounters or awareness of shrinking neighboring populations. We cannot prove the exact channels by which such awareness moved, yet the broad logic is compelling. Human groups notice when nearby peoples become weaker, fewer, or more entangled with strangers. They notice new boats, new smoke, new routes, new absences. In a region as bounded as an island chain, total ignorance of surrounding upheaval is unlikely. Even if the Sentinelese knew only fragments are often enough. One community disappears. Another gets sick. Another is seen in altered relation to outsiders. The warning writes itself. Seen in that light, the Sentinelese resistance may have become not only defensive but preventative. Better to stop contact at the very edge than to manage its consequences later. Better to repel boats before anything is exchanged. Better to answer every uncertain approach with visible strength. Better not to allow the outsider to build a habit of return. In modern language, one might call this border enforcement. In a smaller and older social language, it is simply the work of keeping the dangerous world outside. This helps explain why the island has often seemed so morally difficult to outsiders. A government, missionary, or anthropologist may sincerely believe that contact could bring medicine, protection, and knowledge. From their point of view, refusal seems tragic, even self-defeating. But that view assumes that the outside world can enter without eventually dominating. The history of the Andamans offers little reason for such confidence. For neighboring tribes, outside involvement was not neutral assistance hovering safely at the edge. It became the mechanism through which autonomy unraveled. North Sentinel therefore stands not just as a place apart, but as a verdict on the surrounding history. The island's boundary says something about what happened elsewhere. If nearby peoples had met the outside world and flourished on equal terms, the Sentinelese refusal might look like needless fear. Instead, the record around them is full of collapse, control, disease, and exploitation. Their apparent hostility becomes easier to read once placed beside that record. The island is not refusing paradise. It is refusing a pattern already visible in the region. Even the legal regime around the island today carries the trace of that older lesson. Modern India restricts access to North Sentinel in part because the danger of disease and violent confrontation is so obvious. That policy is often presented as a humanitarian protection, and in one sense it is, but it also acknowledges a deeper failure of the wider historical relationship. The island is protected now precisely because earlier forms of contact in the Andamans were so destructive. The modern no-contact policy is, among other things, a late admission that the outsider's presence has rarely been harmless. There is a quiet irony in this. The Sentinelese, who were once treated as a problem to be solved by contact, are now often defended by law through the principle that they must not be contacted at all. The state that might once have tried to reach them now polices distance. Yet this change does not erase the historical contrast we have been following. Other Andaman peoples did not get to remain at that protected distance. Their worlds were opened by force, accident, disease, infrastructure, and state presence. North Sentinel remained closed long enough for the moral climate around it to change. That timing may be one of the most important facts of all. Had the island been fully penetrated during the 19th century, its people might have suffered the same fate as the great Andamanese. Had a road somehow reached it, they might have faced pressures closer to those endured by the Jarawa. Instead, the boundary held through the most dangerous periods of expansion, and by the time later governments approached with more restraint, the lesson of earlier damage was already too clear to ignore. In that sense, the Sentinelese were not simply stronger resistors. They were resistors who survived long enough for resistance to become internationally legible as something worth respecting. That should not be romanticized. Their isolation is not a fairy tale purity, preserved outside time. It is the product of repeated threat, continual vigilance, and the hard reality that contact in their region usually harmed the weaker side. But it does invite a more serious respect. The Sentinelese may not have written a philosophy of anti-colonial survival. They did something harder. They practiced it. By comparing them with the great Andamanese, the Ong, and the Jarawa, the outline of the story becomes clearer. Shared deep roots did not guarantee the same outcome. The difference was made by exposure, geography, infrastructure, timing, and collective response. The neighboring tribes show what happened when the outside world gained a stable foothold. North Sentinel shows what happened when it did not. The contrast does not reduce the island's mystery, but it gives that mystery a sharper shape. The Sentinelese were not merely the last untouched people by chance. They appear to have been the people who held the line where others, through no fault of their own, were eventually overwhelmed. And that raises an even more intimate question. If their resistance was not simply instinctive fear, and not simply a reflex of distance, then what kind of internal life made such resistance sustainable? What sort of society can live for generations in a way that keeps the outside unnecessary enough to refuse? The answers are harder to see because outsiders have never been allowed far enough in to observe them directly. But the shape of that hidden logic begins to emerge from the edge itself. A community does not defend a boundary so consistently unless the world behind that boundary already gives it reasons to endure. When outsiders describe North Sentinel Island, they often begin with the moments of conflict: the beach, the arrows, the warning calls, the boat that turns away, the helicopter forced back. These are the scenes that survive in news reports and official summaries because they are the few visible moments the outside world can clearly observe. But a society cannot be understood only at the instant it says no. Refusal is the surface. Behind it lies a whole internal way of living that makes refusal possible. A people can only keep the outside away for generations if life inside the boundary is workable enough, meaningful enough, and organized enough that contact feels more dangerous than useful. That is one of the most important shifts in perspective for understanding the Sentinelese. Their story is not only about keeping others out, it is also about having enough within their own world that keeping others out remains a rational choice. If the island could not sustain them, if the society were permanently on the edge of collapse, if shortages forced regular outside exchange, then resistance would weaken over time. One desperate season can undo many years of caution. Yet the continuity of Sentinelese independence suggests that the island has long offered what they need to survive, and that their knowledge of it has been deep enough to turn isolation from a risk into a structure. This does not mean life there is easy. Small island societies face constant pressures: storms, illness, injury, uncertain harvests from the sea, fluctuations in animal life, and the danger that a single bad event may weigh heavily on a modest population. Survival in such a setting requires attention, memory, adaptability, and a strong fit between culture and environment. A people remains separate not because it is static, but because it is capable. North Sentinel Island, whatever its dangers, seems to have supported exactly that kind of capability. The island itself is not large, but size alone says little about abundance. A small area can still support long-term human life if land and sea are used together. North Sentinel's dense forest likely provides fruits, roots, materials for shelter, and habitats for birds and small animals. The surrounding waters and reefs likely provide fish, mollusks, turtles, and other marine resources. A community adapted to both inland and coastal gathering can draw from several ecological layers at once. This matters because dependence on one narrow food source is risky. Diversity within the local environment gives resilience. Accounts from brief observations suggest that the Sentinelese are hunter-gatherers with strong marine knowledge, using bows, arrows, spears, and canoes suited to local waters. Their canoes appear to be used mainly in shallow coastal zones and lagoons rather than for long deep-sea voyages. That alone tells us something important. They seem to live in close relation to the island's edge, rather than as a society oriented toward wide exchange by sea. Their mobility is local, intimate, and strategic. They do not appear to be a trading people whose economy depends on moving regularly between distant islands. Their world is centered on what can be taken, caught, gathered, built, and defended nearby. That kind of local sufficiency changes the meaning of isolation. In many parts of history, remote communities still relied on trade networks for critical goods: stone, salt, metals, marriage partners, ritual items, or staple foods during lean times. If a society needs outside goods to function, then the outside can eventually force its way in by controlling access to what has become necessary. But if the Sentinelese could live with little or no regular dependence on such networks, then their independence had stronger foundations. Refusal becomes much easier when contact offers no indispensable advantage. The presence of metal tools or weapon points among the Sentinelese does not cancel this picture. Observers have noted that they appear to use metal, much of it likely scavenged or repurposed from shipwreck debris, drift material, or other objects washed ashore. That is a subtle but significant distinction. A society can incorporate foreign material without entering a foreign system. Picking up useful metal from the shore is not the same as depending on merchants, states, or mission stations. In fact, it may fit perfectly with a self-sufficient strategy. Take what the sea delivers, reshape it locally, owe nothing in return. That practical opportunism may be one of the hidden strengths of the community. Complete refusal does not require rejecting every object from beyond the island. It only requires rejecting the relationship that would make such objects a chain. The Sentinelese may have been perfectly capable of recognizing that a metal fragment is superior to stone for certain purposes, while also recognizing that regular exchange with outsiders is dangerous. Those two recognitions are not contradictory. They show selectivity, not ignorance. Food is perhaps the clearest place where internal sufficiency matters. A people living successfully on a small island over long stretches of time must know its rhythms in detail. They must know where fish gather, when tides expose reef life, where nesting birds can be found, which plants are useful, which seasons alter access to resources, where fresh water can be secured, and how storms reshape the coast. Such knowledge is not decorative. It is the skeleton of daily life. And because it is learned slowly, often through childhood observation and practice, it binds the community tightly to place. The island is not just home in an emotional sense. It is a living map of accumulated survival knowledge. That creates a powerful reason to resist outside influence. Outside systems often replace local skill with dependency. A state offers rations. A mission offers cloth and tools. A market offers manufactured goods. At first, these things may seem like additions. Over time, they can hollow out older forms of self-reliance. If a small society begins to depend on imported food, imported medicine, imported metal, imported rules, then the knowledge embedded in its landscape loses some of its daily necessity. Once that process begins, the community's bond with place can weaken. The Sentinelese appear to have avoided that shift. Their society still seems organized around the island's own logic, rather than an external supply chain. Shelter and settlement patterns also matter here. Brief outsider observations have described huts or structures on the island, though not in enough detail to give a full architectural account. Even so, one can infer that housing is adapted to local weather, mobility, and social organization. In tropical island settings, shelter often balances airflow, rainfall protection, and access to resources rather than aiming at permanence in the monumental sense familiar to settled agricultural states. A house may be less a symbol of fixed property than part of a flexible relationship with coastal and forest zones. If so, Sentinelese life may be organized in ways that allow movement within the island according to season, subsistence, or security. That flexibility would strengthen survival. A rigid, centralized village can be vulnerable. A more mobile pattern of occupation, where groups can shift, hide, disperse, or regroup, makes outside intrusion harder to control. Colonial landing parties searching abandoned huts on North Sentinel often found exactly that problem. Habitation could be detected, but inhabitants themselves were gone or watching from elsewhere. This suggests not an absence of order, but a practiced capacity to manage visibility. A society built to stay hidden does not need every member standing in plain sight. It needs the ability to let outsiders see only what the community chooses to expose. The shoreline behavior described by outsiders points toward some kind of organized vigilance. The Sentinelese do not appear to stumble in confusion whenever a boat approaches. Men often arrive armed and alert, sometimes in numbers, sometimes from several positions. That suggests communication systems, whether verbal, gestural, or simply habitual, that allow rapid response to threats. On a small island, such vigilance may be part of ordinary life. Watching the coast may be as normal as fishing or gathering. In that sense, defense is not an occasional military act separated from daily existence. It is woven into daily existence. There is something almost architectural about that. The island's reef, beach, tree line, and interior paths may together form a defensive landscape. The reef slows boats. The open beach exposes arrivals. The vegetation conceals defenders. The interior provides fallback depth if needed. A community that has inhabited such a place for generations will know exactly how to use each zone. Outsiders, by contrast, face uncertainty at every step. They do not know where the ground changes, where sightlines open, where hidden observers stand, or how quickly reinforcements may appear. A defended shoreline does not have to be large to be effective. It only has to be understood better by those protecting it. Population size is another difficult but essential question. Estimates of the Sentinelese population have varied widely because accurate counting is impossible without direct contact, which should not occur. The real number may be small, perhaps only in the dozens or low hundreds. To modern eyes, that can seem fragile, and indeed it is fragile in some ways. A small population can be vulnerable to epidemic disease, demographic bottlenecks, and sudden disasters. Yet small size can also support tight social cohesion. Everyone may know everyone. Memory travels quickly. Shared rules can be reinforced without large institutions. The entire society may be capable of acting with unusual consistency because social distance within it is limited. That does not mean such a society is simple. Small populations can still have rich forms of kinship, ritual, age structure, division of labor, and conflict management. Complexity does not require scale in the bureaucratic sense. In fact, some of the most durable social systems in human history have depended not on written law and formal offices, but on repeated practice, shared expectation, and strong oral transmission. If the Sentinelese have maintained separation for generations, then some form of that transmission must exist. Children must learn not just practical tasks, but the emotional and moral meaning of strangers. They must know what the boundary is, why it matters, and how to behave when it is tested. This is where the idea of culture becomes especially important. Outsiders often explain Sentinelese resistance in material terms alone: disease risk, geography, prior bad experiences, all of those are real. But over long stretches of time, material pressures become social values. A community does not merely remember that outsiders once brought danger. It builds that recognition into stories, caution, etiquette, and identity. The warning becomes part of what it means to belong. The beach is not just a place where enemies may arrive. It is a moral edge. On one side lies the known world of kinship and skill. On the other lies the source of disruption. If such values become deeply rooted, then contact ceases to look attractive, even when particular outsiders claim good intentions. This may help explain why gestures of friendliness have repeatedly failed. A people shaped by long-term border discipline is not likely to be won over by gifts alone, because the issue is not simple suspicion that can be dissolved by kindness. The issue is that outside relation itself may be coded as danger. To cross into such a worldview with coconuts or a smiling wave is to misunderstand how deep the barrier goes. One of the most striking things about North Sentinel is that it appears to lack what many outsiders imagine isolated peoples must secretly desire: incorporation into a larger world. There is little sign that the Sentinelese seek escape, alliance, trade, or migration outward. They do not seem to send envoys. They do not seem to approach other islands asking for metal, cloth, or food. They do not appear to use the sea as an opening into outside society. This matters because it suggests that their community is not structured around lack. It is structured around enoughness, not abundance in the modern consumer sense, but enough to continue, enough to make continuity preferable to transformation. That state of enoughness may be one of the rarest and most threatening things from the perspective of expansionist societies. The outside world often assumes that every community can eventually be drawn in through desire. Offer better tools, offer religion, offer medicine, offer status, offer safety. Somewhere, surely, the boundary will soften. But what if the people behind the boundary do not evaluate their life through those measures? What if the outside world's greatest weakness is believing itself universally desirable? The Sentinelese seem to challenge that assumption at the most basic level. Their apparent lack of agriculture on a large, settled scale may also matter in this regard. Agricultural states tend to expand and to understand value through surplus, storage, property, and territory that can be measured and governed. A foraging society tied to mixed coastal resources often operates under a different rhythm. Mobility, immediate return from gathered or caught food, and flexible use of land can reduce the need for fixed infrastructure that outsiders can capture or control. Such a society may be harder to absorb because there is no central granary, no tax base, no obvious administrative core to seize. The outside power can arrive, but what exactly does it take possession of? Trees, beaches, pathways, and people who do not want to be ruled. This does not make foraging societies invulnerable. History shows the opposite. But on North Sentinel, that mode of life may have aligned especially well with resistance. A community that can feed itself from land and sea without major permanent installations is harder to lock down. It can remain elusive, difficult to count, difficult to predict, difficult to transform. The very things that colonial and state powers often dismiss as primitive can become powerful shields against incorporation. Another overlooked element is emotional continuity. Life in a small island world likely depends on trust at close range. Tasks are shared. Danger is collective. Knowledge passes face to face. In such an environment, outsiders do not arrive as neutral individuals, but as disruptions to a finely balanced emotional system. A stranger is not just a new person. He is an unknown variable in a world where predictability may be essential for survival. Multiply that by generations of negative experience, and the social logic becomes clearer. The safest stranger is the stranger who never lands. The island's children, if we imagine their upbringing carefully, would grow into this logic almost from birth. They would learn the shape of canoes, the sound of waves over reef, the places where food is found, the difference between ordinary coastal watching and urgent alertness. They would observe how adults respond to distant boats. They would hear whatever stories their society tells about danger, memory, and the sea. None of this requires formal schooling, as outsiders understand it. It requires repetition. It requires elders. It requires a social world that remains intact long enough to keep teaching itself. That may be why disease has always been such a severe threat in discussions about contact. The danger is not only that some individuals would die. The danger is that a small society could lose key transmitters of knowledge in a very short time. A few deaths in the wrong age group can damage memory itself. Skills disappear. Kinship links strain. Children lose teachers. Confidence in the ordinary order of life weakens. Once that happens, outside dependence may follow, not because it is desired, but because the internal system has been torn. From the Sentinelese point of view, then, resisting contact is not simply about avoiding immediate sickness. It is about protecting the continuity of the whole social fabric. It is also possible that North Sentinel's people maintain some forms of ritual or symbolic life connected to territory that outsiders cannot see and should not try to force into view. Most human societies bind land, ancestry, and meaning together. Sacred places, remembered roots, origin stories, taboos, and ceremonial acts often shape how a community understands its environment. To an outsider, a forest may look like unused space. To those who live there, it may be layered with meaning. If the Sentinelese have such structures of significance, then contact threatens not just health and autonomy, but the invisible order through which the island is understood. This is another reason why the phrase, "built to stay hidden," should not be taken too mechanically. The society may not have been designed in some conscious engineering sense for concealment alone. Rather, over generations, a way of life emerged that made concealment, vigilance, and refusal natural extensions of ordinary existence. Subsistence, movement, social teaching, and territorial identity, all aligned with keeping the outside at bay. The result is a community whose resistance looks dramatic only from the outside. From within, it may simply feel normal. And that normality may be the deepest challenge the island presents to the modern imagination. Modern states, development projects, and missionary visions all tend to assume that closed societies are waiting for history to arrive. North Sentinel suggests something else. It suggests a society whose history has already arrived in its own form, and whose continuation depends precisely on preventing other histories from taking over. Their refusal is not evidence that they have no culture of consequence. It may be evidence that their culture of consequence still works. What outsiders see at the beach, then, is only the final visible gesture of a much larger order. The drawn bow represents more than immediate fear. It represents a world in which food, movement, kinship, memory, and place remain joined tightly enough that the outsider has no obvious offer strong enough to outweigh his risks. A society built to stay hidden is really a society built to remain itself. And that is why repeated contact attempts have failed so predictably. the outside world often approached as though the problem were one of first impressions. Arrive gently enough, offer enough gifts, wait long enough, and surely suspicion would fade. But a boundary sustained by an entire internal system is not undone by patience alone. To cross it would mean changing the conditions that make the system coherent. At some level, the Sentinelese seem to understand that with great clarity. Their resistance is not only a reaction to who outsiders are, it is a defense of what life on the island already is. Which brings us to the next layer of the story. If the hidden social logic of North Sentinel made refusal durable, what happened when outsiders tried again and again to force or soften that refusal anyway? The answer lies in the long chain of failed approaches, each one revealing in its own way that the island's boundary was not accidental, and that every attempt to cross it only confirmed how much was at stake. By the time North Sentinel Island began appearing in modern records with any regularity, the pattern was already forming. Outsiders approached with confidence, caution, curiosity, fear, science, religion, or administrative purpose. The island answered with distance. Sometimes that distance took the form of disappearance into the forest. Sometimes it took the form of armed warning. Sometimes it ended in death. Across more than a century, the details changed, but the deeper result did not. Every attempt to reach the Sentinelese ran into the same hard fact: the boundary was real, and those living behind it meant to keep it that way. It is useful to trace these attempts one by one because each reveals a different misunderstanding from the outside. Some believed force would solve the problem. Some believed gifts would soften it. Some believed humanitarian concern would justify it. Some believed spiritual mission made the risk worthwhile. Yet the island treated all of these motives as secondary. Outsiders kept arriving with reasons. The Sentinelese kept responding to arrival itself. The 19th century provides the first substantial modern episodes, and they unfolded within the logic of empire. British administrators expanding their control through the Andaman Islands did not see remote indigenous societies as permanent equals with a right to remain unknown. They saw them as subjects of inquiry, obstacles to administration, possible threats to navigation, or populations to be managed. In such a worldview, leaving a people entirely alone was rarely considered a satisfying outcome. A blank on the map invited intervention. North Sentinel became one more place the empire wished to reduce into knowledge. Early British encounters were marked by uncertainty. Landing parties sometimes found huts, pathways, abandoned camps, or signs of recent habitation, but the inhabitants themselves often withdrew before stable contact could form. That alone is revealing. The Sentinelese did not wait passively to be studied. They controlled visibility. They could vanish when necessary and reappear when the balance favored them. For outsiders hoping for the familiar colonial rhythm of first contact, exchange, and eventual supervision, this made the island unusually frustrating. That frustration culminated in one of the most notorious episodes associated with Maurice Vidal-Portman, the colonial officer whose name remains tied to several deeply invasive expeditions in the Andamans. Portman was driven by a mixture of bureaucratic curiosity, anthropological ambition, and colonial entitlement. On an expedition to North Sentinel in the late 19th century, he and his men reportedly found deserted settlements and continued inland until they succeeded in seizing several islanders, including elderly adults and children. These captives were taken away to Port Blair. The older people soon became ill and died. The children were later returned to the island, reportedly with gifts. Few episodes reveal the likely foundation of Sentinelese hostility more clearly than this one. From an outsider's point of view, it may have been recorded as an exploratory contact or a regrettable but useful experiment. From the islanders' point of view, it could only have appeared as a violent abduction ending in death. Strangers arrived from the sea, captured members of the community, carried them away, and brought back the surviving children altered by their contact with the outside world. Even if this happened only once in exactly that form, its memory would have been enough to harden attitudes for generations. If a people needed a practical lesson in what outsiders could mean, they had it. Portman's expedition also exposed a broader colonial habit, the belief that indigenous lives could be interrupted, displayed, measured, and repositioned in the name of knowledge. That belief was not unique to the Andamans. It appeared in many parts of the world wherever empires classified local peoples as objects of study rather than self-defending societies. But on North Sentinel, the result may have been especially consequential, because the island's small scale magnified every loss. A kidnapping in a small community is not a distant statistic. It is personal, unforgettable, and politically clear. For a long time after these early episodes, contact remained uncertain and irregular. Ships passed through nearby waters. Officials and sailors knew of the island's existence. But there was no sustained colonial occupation on North Sentinel itself, no mission settlement, no permanent administrative post. That absence sometimes tempts modern readers to imagine a long, quiet gap in which nothing much happened. The more likely reality is different. The island remained present in regional awareness, but the practical difficulty and limited value of sustained intervention kept pressure intermittent. The Sentinelese did not need to win one final decisive battle. They only needed to make each new approach uncertain enough, dangerous enough, and unrewarding enough that outsiders failed to establish a foothold. When India replaced British rule as the governing power in the Andamans, the moral language around contact began to shift. The age of openly imperial pacification was fading. Anthropologists, administrators, and officials increasingly spoke about tribal welfare, protection, and careful engagement. North Sentinel was no longer merely a stubborn blank in the colonial archive. It became, in the language of the modern state, a protected indigenous space whose inhabitants were both vulnerable and difficult to reach. That sounded gentler, and in some respects, it was. But the underlying desire to establish some form of relationship remained. By the mid-20th century, and especially from the 1960s onward, Indian authorities organized a series of contact expeditions intended to approach the island more carefully than the British had done. These missions usually involved officials, police, boat crews, and at times anthropologists. Their methods were shaped by a belief that gradual, peaceful contact might be possible if fear could be reduced slowly. Rather than seizing people, they would leave gifts. Rather than forcing long landings, they would test responses from offshore. The hope was that repeated nonviolent visits would create familiarity and lower hostility. Coconuts became central to this strategy. Since coconuts do not grow naturally in abundance on North Sentinel in the same way they might on some other islands, they were thought to be attractive offerings. They could be rolled or floated ashore. They were easy to observe from a boat. They had immediate practical value. On paper, this seemed like a sensible first move. A useful object, no obvious strings attached, no immediate attempt to invade the interior. But the strategy also revealed how much the outside world wanted to believe that material generosity could bypass historical distrust. Some of these expeditions produced scenes that outsiders read as promising. Sentinelese men and women sometimes came onto the beach to watch. On a few occasions, islanders reportedly picked up the coconuts. At times, they allowed boats to come somewhat closer before signaling them away. Such moments were carefully recorded because they seemed to suggest movement. Perhaps, If the same pattern continued, a more stable relationship might form. Perhaps cautious repetition would build confidence where force had failed. Yet the problem with this interpretation was that it treated every reduction in immediate hostility as the beginning of friendship. That was never necessarily true. An island community may inspect foreign objects for practical reasons without accepting the people who delivered them. Curiosity is not surrender. Strategic patience is not trust. Even more important, the very act of approaching again and again may have carried a different meaning from the Sentinelese side. What officials saw as careful outreach, the islanders may have seen as persistent testing of the perimeter. That tension appears clearly in the rhythm of these missions. Boats would approach, gifts would be displayed or dropped, Sentinelese observers would gather. Sometimes they would remain at a distance, sometimes they would shout, sometimes they would brandish bows and arrows, sometimes they would accept the objects once the visitors retreated. Then the boats would leave. Nothing lasting was established. No neutral meeting ground emerged. No reliable conversation began. Each encounter ended where it began, with outsiders off the island and the islanders still in control of access. In some reports from the late 20th century, there are moments that almost look like breakthroughs. On one or two occasions, observers describe Sentinelese individuals entering the shallows to collect coconuts directly from the water or from boats positioned nearby. Such scenes have often been remembered as the closest anyone came to peaceful contact, but even these moments remain deeply ambiguous. The islanders controlled the distance. They decided how close to come. They could withdraw instantly. They could threaten if the line shifted. It was not the beginning of open relations. It was a tightly managed inspection at the edge of danger. The presence of women and children in some of these observed gatherings has also been interpreted in different ways. Outsiders sometimes took it as a sign that the Sentinelese felt less threatened than before. That may be so in a limited sense, but it could also indicate confidence in their own control over the situation. A society that believes it can regulate the shoreline may allow more of its members to witness a contact event without believing it has become safe. Confidence in defense is not the same as acceptance of intimacy. One of the most telling features of the Indian expeditions is that even when they were least violent, they still struggled with a basic contradiction. They were trying to persuade a community into contact while claiming to respect its autonomy. But if a community's autonomy includes the right to reject contact, then repeated attempts to soften that rejection are already a form of pressure. The state approached with friendly intentions, but it still assumed that outreach was legitimate and perhaps even desirable. The Sentinelese answered that assumption by holding their line. In time, many officials began to recognize that the contact strategy was failing or producing, at best, unstable superficial results. Concerns about disease risk also grew. A small island population, with no immunity to common outside infections, could be devastated by even well-meaning contact. This problem was not theoretical. The history of other Andaman peoples made it painfully real. So the very missions meant to create peaceful relations carried the possibility of doing irreparable harm the moment they succeeded too well. That realization would gradually contribute to a broader no-contact approach. But before that shift became firm, the island continued to generate episodes that exposed the old tension between curiosity and danger. One of the most famous involved a film crew and officials in the 1970s when a National Geographic team joined an Indian expedition. The visit was meant in part to document contact efforts. Instead, it produced a scene of unmistakable hostility. Arrows were fired. One reportedly struck the filmmaker's leg. Whatever the ambitions of the mission, the island's message was clear. Documentation did not make intrusion welcome. cameras were still outsiders. There is something revealing in the presence of media at such a moment. The modern world often imagines that being seen is a kind of soft power, that visibility brings understanding, sympathy, or inclusion. But for the Sentinelese, being filmed may have meant nothing good at all. A camera does not explain itself. It records without permission. It turns people into images that travel away. In that sense, the camera belongs to the same family as mapping, measuring, and collecting. It is part of the outsider's hunger to take something home, even if only a picture. Not all fatal encounters involved official missions. In 1981, the cargo ship Primrose ran aground on a reef near North Sentinel Island. The crew, stranded offshore, reportedly saw armed islanders gathering on the beach and feared an attack if the weather calmed enough to allow boats to reach them. Rescue eventually came before direct confrontation occurred. This event is important because it shows the island's defensive posture outside the controlled framework of government expeditions. The Sentinelese did not become less vigilant simply because a vessel arrived by accident rather than by administrative design. A grounded ship near their reef still represented an intrusion, an opportunity, or a threat requiring response. Shipwrecks and drifting debris may have played a quiet role in the island's material history. Useful metals and other objects could wash ashore from accidents without requiring formal exchange. But this did not soften the social boundary. If anything, it may have strengthened the Sentinelese ability to remain independent by giving them occasional access to foreign materials without foreign relationships. The sea delivered tools while the people still rejected the toolmakers. Another major test came after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. Across the region, the disaster killed enormous numbers of people and transformed coastlines. The authorities were understandably anxious about remote communities. Had the Sentinelese survived? Were they injured? Did they need rescue or supplies? A helicopter was sent to check on the island. What followed became one of the most quoted modern episodes in the history of North Sentinel. A Sentinelese man appeared and shot arrows or otherwise signaled aggressive refusal at the aircraft, forcing it to keep its distance. From the perspective of relief logic, this seemed startling. Here was a community that had just lived through one of the most destructive natural events in modern memory, and yet it still rejected outside help. But that reaction makes more sense when seen through the island's own history. To the Sentinelese, the helicopter was not a neutral machine of humanitarian aid. It was another foreign object descending from beyond the horizon, noisy, intrusive, and impossible to interpret safely. Their response showed not confusion but continuity. Even after a massive environmental shock, the boundary remained active. The community was still functioning well enough to detect, judge, and repel. The post-tsunami overflight also revealed one of the deepest misreadings outsiders often bring to North Sentinel. They assume that emergency will automatically override separation. But emergency from inside the modern world's perspective is not always emergency from inside a radically different social system. The Sentinelese survived by trusting their own practices, their own landscape, their own community. A machine arriving from outside in the wake of catastrophe might not look like salvation. It might look like the beginning of a worse danger. As the years passed, India's official stance moved more decisively toward non-interference. Contact missions were largely reduced or abandoned. Protection zones around the island were reinforced. The logic was increasingly clear. To keep trying to make contact was not only ineffective, but potentially disastrous. North Sentinel's autonomy could best be respected by preventing outsiders from getting close at all. In a sense, the state began finally to align with what the island had been saying from the start. And then came the episode that forced North Sentinel back into global headlines: the 2018 arrival of John Allen Chau. Chau was an American evangelical missionary who believed he had a divine calling to bring Christianity to the Sentinelese. He arranged illegally to be taken near the island by local fishermen and attempted contact over multiple days. His own writings suggest that he understood the danger, but believed the religious importance of his mission outweighed it. He shouted words of greeting, offered gifts, and eventually tried to land. He was killed. That death produced fierce debate around the world. Some people saw Chau as a martyr driven by sincere faith. Others saw him as reckless, arrogant, and blind to both law and history. For understanding North Sentinel, the important point is that his motives changed nothing. He did not arrive as a colonial officer, a government anthropologist, or a relief worker. He arrived as a missionary. Yet from the island's perspective, he was still an uninvited outsider crossing a forbidden boundary. The island's response was consistent with what it had done before. In some ways, Chau's case exposes the most stubborn misunderstanding of all: the outsider's belief that noble intention can dissolve structural danger. Chau seems to have thought that personal courage, religious love, and individual sacrifice might open a path where official missions had failed. But North Sentinel's resistance was never primarily about whether this outsider or that outsider meant well. It was about the cumulative fact that outsiders bring transformation, disease, dependency, or control. A lone missionary with a Bible is still part of that larger pattern if he arrives without consent. The global reaction to Chau's death also showed how often modern people reduce the island's history to a single dramatic moment. Yet his story was only the latest entry in a much older chain. Before him came colonial seizures, hesitant gift missions, arrows at film crews, warnings to helicopters, defensive standoffs at reefs, and the long memory of surrounding tribal collapse. To isolate Chau's death from that history is to miss its meaning. He was not the exception to the pattern. He was the pattern returning in a modern key. One should also remember the local people drawn into his attempt. Fishermen who ferried him toward the island crossed legal and moral boundaries too. Their participation shows that the outer ring of protection around North Sentinel is not only about the islanders and the state. It also depends on the conduct of neighboring populations, law enforcement, and the wider culture's willingness not to turn the island into an object of thrill, profit, or spiritual conquest. Every attempted intrusion requires accomplices on the outside. The island must be defended from both directions. Taken together, these episodes show that every attempt to reach them did not fail for one simple reason. Some failed because of geography. Some failed because the islanders were armed and organized. Some failed because the outsiders underestimated disease risk, overestimated good intentions, or misunderstood the meaning of cautious curiosity. Some failed because the political will to force total penetration was not strong enough, but all failed within the same larger truth. The Sentinelese never signaled consent to be brought into an outside relationship. That is why the history of North Sentinel is not really a history of progressive approach. It is a history of repeated confirmation. Each new expedition or intrusion tested the same boundary, and each time the island demonstrated that the boundary was still there. Even changes in method, from kidnapping to gifts to aerial inspection, only revealed the consistency of the reply. The outside world changed its tools. The island changed almost nothing. There is also a striking reversal hidden in this long sequence. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, outsiders imagined themselves as the active side. They were the explorers, officials, scholars, missionaries, or rescuers. The islanders appeared as the reactive side, merely obstructing or resisting the initiatives of others. But if one looks across the whole history, the deeper continuity belongs to the Sentinelese. They are the constant. Outsiders came and went with different uniforms, technologies, and moral vocabularies. The island's defense remained the most stable force in the story. In that sense, each failed attempt tells us something not just about the island, but about the limits of the modern world's self-image. The world often believes it can approach any frontier with the right mix of science, law, compassion, or conviction, and eventually be admitted. North Sentinel suggests otherwise. There are still boundaries that do not yield, simply because the outsider insists his purpose is justified. And once one accepts that, the island begins to look less like a riddle waiting to be solved, and more like a fact waiting to be respected. Every attempt to reach them failed, not because the world had not yet found the right method, but because the islanders did not want to be reached. That sounds obvious, almost too obvious. Yet history shows how long it has taken outsiders to absorb that simple point. What remains, then, is not another plan for contact, but a deeper reflection on what North Sentinel means in a world that assumes contact is destiny. The island has endured not just by violence, not just by luck, and not just by remoteness, but by a long, disciplined refusal that exposed how destructive the outside world could be. The last chapter of the story lies there, in the meaning of that refusal, and in the strange possibility that what the Sentinelese preserved was not backwardness at all, but one of humanity's rare remaining rights. The right to be left alone. By the time the modern world finally began to say that North Sentinel Island should be left alone, the island had already spent generations saying the same thing in its own language, through its own actions, and with a consistency that almost no outside power had managed to break. That is one of the strangest features of the story. The outside world likes to imagine itself as the source of moral progress, the side that eventually learns to be humane, careful, and respectful. Yet in the case of North Sentinel, the clearest moral position may have been taken by the islanders long before governments, journalists, scholars, and missionaries fully understood it. The island's message was simple: do not come here. It took the modern world an astonishingly long time to hear it. This final part of the story is not really about one more attempt to approach the beach. It is about what the existence of North Sentinel Island means now, at a time when satellites can map almost everything, aircraft cross oceans in hours, and most human societies have been pulled, willingly or not, into overlapping networks of trade, law, media, and medicine. In such a world, North Sentinel looks almost impossible. It seems to belong to an older age, as if it should have disappeared already under the pressure of modern systems. But it did not disappear. It remained. And that survival forces a difficult question on the rest of humanity. When a society makes clear, over and over, that it does not want incorporation, what does the modern world owe it? Curiosity? Rescue? Conversion? Documentation? Or distance? The answer that has gradually emerged in official policy is distance. India, which governs the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, maintains a legal exclusion zone around North Sentinel Island and bars ordinary travel or contact. This is often described as a protective measure, and it is. It protects the Sentinelese from diseases that could devastate them. It protects outsiders from likely violent confrontation. It protects the island from turning into a spectacle for adventurers, thrill-seekers, or exploitative tourism. But it also does something more subtle. It recognizes, at least in practical terms, that the island's refusal has legitimacy. That recognition did not come quickly, and it did not arise from pure idealism. It was shaped by history, Officials and anthropologists knew what had happened to other Andaman peoples after prolonged contact. They knew how fragile small indigenous populations could be in the face of infection. They knew that even well-meaning intervention could be deadly. They also knew that repeated efforts at outreach had not created trust, only recurring tension. The no-contact policy grew partly from ethics, but also from accumulated evidence. Contact did not merely fail. It failed in a way that exposed how dangerous success might be. There is a certain humility in that conclusion, though it is a humility the modern world rarely arrives at comfortably. Most states assume they have both the right and the duty to know what happens within their borders. They count populations, they classify languages, they register births, they offer schools, clinics, policing, and development schemes. To step back from that and allow a community to remain outside most of those systems is highly unusual. It means accepting that sovereignty, administration, and humanitarian concern all have limits when placed beside a small society's determined will to remain separate. Of course, this policy leaves many people uneasy. A common objection is that the Sentinelese are vulnerable, and that vulnerability creates a duty to intervene. What if a cyclone hits? What if a disease spreads within the island? What if the population is declining? What if there are injuries or shortages that could be relieved with modern medicine? These questions are not cruel. In many cases, they come from genuine concern. But concern alone does not erase the danger built into intervention. To save a society from a hypothetical crisis by exposing it to an almost certain epidemiological and cultural crisis is not straightforward mercy. It may be the beginning of extinction in another form. That tension becomes especially sharp when people speak about medicine. Modern medicine can do extraordinary things. It can treat infections, repair injuries, reduce infant mortality, and prolong life. To outsiders, it may seem obvious that no society would rationally reject such benefits. But medicine does not arrive in isolation. It arrives with personnel, systems, follow-up, supply chains, record-keeping, repeated contact, and trust relationships. A vaccination campaign, a rescue mission, or a regular clinic cannot operate in a vacuum. Once such systems begin, so does deeper incorporation. For a tiny population with no immunity to ordinary outside diseases, the very first stage of help may unleash the very dangers medicine is meant to prevent. There is also a deeper issue hidden beneath the medical argument. Outsiders often assume that extending life and reducing suffering are the highest possible goods in all human circumstances. That may sound obviously true, but history complicates it. Societies do not live by biology alone. They live by continuity, memory, autonomy, kinship, landscape, and meaning. A contact policy that saves a few lives immediately but destroys the social fabric through which a people has understood itself for centuries may not be experienced as salvation by those living through it. It may be experienced as unraveling. This is one reason the phrase, "the last uncontacted society," carries such emotional weight. It sounds at first like a label of remoteness, as if North Sentinel were simply the final blank spot on a map. But it really marks a frontier in the ethics of power. The modern world has contacted almost everyone else, often by force, deceit, or unbalanced dependence. North Sentinel remains because one community has so far resisted that process. The island's continued existence is therefore not just anthropological curiosity. It is evidence that total incorporation of humanity into one global order is not complete. That fact can be unsettling to modern sensibilities, because the modern world likes universality. It likes to think that its categories apply everywhere. Citizenship, rights, health systems, education, development, religion, markets, communications, humanitarianism. North Sentinel does not fit neatly into those categories, not because the people there are less human, but because they remain outside the institutions through which modern humanity usually expresses itself. Their existence asks whether a society must be legible to the modern state in order to deserve respect. The no-contact answer, at least for now, is no. Still, this answer comes with paradoxes. The Indian government claims and protects the island as part of national territory, yet it also declines to govern the island in the ordinary sense. The Sentinelese are, formally speaking, within a state they do not recognize, subject to laws they do not know, and protected by policies they did not request in legal language. Their autonomy survives within a larger political structure that both restrains intrusion and asserts authority over the territory from which it keeps others away. This arrangement is practical, perhaps necessary, but it is also strange. It reminds us that true independence and protected isolation are not identical things. The role of law here is therefore limited but important. Law cannot make the Sentinelese safe in any absolute sense. It cannot stop storms, shipwrecks, or every reckless intruder. But it can create a protective buffer around the island. It can punish outsiders who try to cross the boundary. It can signal that curiosity, mission work, and unauthorized contact are not harmless adventures. In that sense, the law has become an outer wall, supporting the island's own refusal. The Sentinelese defend the inner wall. The state, at its best, defends the outer one. But law alone is not enough. The modern threat to North Sentinel no longer comes mainly from organized colonial conquest. It comes from smaller forms of pressure that can be just as destructive in practice. Thrill-seeking travelers, illegal fishermen, missionaries convinced they carry universal truth, media hunger for dramatic images, and a digital culture that turns every forbidden place into a challenge. In the age of online spectacle, a protected island can become a temptation precisely because it is protected. The boundary invites violation from people who mistake restraint for romance. This is where John Allen Chau's death, widely reported and intensely debated, carries a lesson beyond the tragedy itself. The danger was not only that one man died. The deeper danger was that he tried to turn North Sentinel into a stage for personal spiritual heroism. He did not see the island primarily as a society with its own right to remain apart. He saw it as a mission field, a place where his calling should override their refusal. That mindset is old, even if the individual case was modern. It belongs to the long global history of outsiders deciding that the inner life of another people is incomplete until rewritten by foreign conviction. Such thinking is not confined to religion. Scientists can make similar errors when they treat isolated peoples as rare data sets waiting to be sampled. Journalists can do it when they pursue images that reduce a guarded society to visual shock. Humanitarians can do it when they imagine that care automatically grants them permission. Tourists can do it when they convert distance into a thrill. Different motives, same assumption. The outsider's desire matters more than the island's refusal. North Sentinel remains important partly because it stands against that assumption so absolutely. This is why the island has taken on an almost symbolic role in the modern imagination. For some, it represents purity, a surviving piece of humanity untouched by corruption. For others, it represents danger, hostility, and the stubborn refusal of progress. Both of these readings are too simple. The Sentinelese are not symbols made for the outside world's fantasies. They are a living society whose survival has depended on making the outside world less central than it wishes to be. Romanticizing them is one form of disrespect. Demonizing them is another. The harder task is to accept them as they appear to have accepted themselves, not as a lesson for our myths, but as a people with their own priorities. The phrase untouched is especially misleading. North Sentinel is not untouched by history. Its people have lived through storms, environmental change, colonial intrusion, neighboring collapse, state interest, aerial overflight, and repeated attempts at contact. They have likely used foreign materials, washed ashore, seen passing ships, and recognized that the sea sometimes brings new dangers. To call them untouched is to imagine history as something that only happens through direct incorporation into modern systems. In reality, history has been pressing on North Sentinel for centuries. The remarkable thing is not that history never arrived. It is that the island resisted being absorbed by it. That resistance has often been described in defensive terms, and rightly so. But there is another way to think about it. The Sentinelese may not simply be resisting us. They may be preserving a form of human continuity that the rest of the world no longer knows how to value properly. By that, I do not mean that their life is better in every imaginable respect, or that isolation should be idealized. I mean that they have maintained something modern societies frequently lose: a complete social world, scaled to place, kinship, memory, and direct subsistence, rather than to abstract systems of accumulation and administration. To modern ears, this can sound like romantic anti-modernism, and one must be careful. Life on North Sentinel is surely hard in ways most outsiders would not willingly choose. It likely involves constant exposure to weather, injury without surgery, danger without institutional rescue, and losses that cannot be cushioned by complex medical or economic systems. One should not turn that reality into a fantasy of noble simplicity. Yet one should also not assume that comfort alone defines a worthwhile life. Human beings have lived meaningfully under many conditions. The fact that the Sentinelese continue to reject incorporation suggests that, by their own measure, what they preserve matters more than what they might gain. There is also a profound lesson here about consent. Modern discussions of human rights often speak in universal language, but they do not always handle collective refusal well. We readily understand an individual's right to say no to unwanted intrusion. We struggle more when an entire society says no to contact, research, religion, or development. We search for exceptions. We ask whether they are informed enough to refuse, healthy enough to refuse, modern enough to refuse. Yet that instinct itself can become colonial. It implies that some peoples must justify their no more thoroughly than others, because their chosen way of life offends the outside world's expectations. North Sentinel pushes back against that double standard. The island's refusal is blunt, and perhaps that is why it is easier to respect in practice than the more ambiguous boundaries other indigenous societies try to maintain. There are no negotiated half measures there, no tourist corridors, no documentary permissions, no state schools at the edge, no missionary compounds offering gifts. The message arrives in a form the modern world cannot misunderstand for very long. Stay away. And because the message is so clear, outsiders are forced to confront a possibility they usually avoid. That respect may require not approach, but abstention. This has implications beyond one island. Around the world, indigenous communities continue to struggle for land, autonomy, language survival, and control over how outsiders enter their lives. Most are not uncontacted, and most cannot retreat behind a reef. They live amid states, markets, roads, mines, and media systems that press in constantly. North Sentinel is not a direct model for them, but it does sharpen the ethical issue. If one community's absolute refusal can eventually be recognized, however uneasily, then perhaps more ordinary forms of indigenous boundary setting deserve greater seriousness too. The island is extreme, but the principle is not. Consent matters. Scale matters. Outsider desire is not automatically a moral claim. There is another way North Sentinel troubles modern thinking. The island reminds us that progress is not one road, that every society is simply farther or closer along. Modern civilization often imagines history as a ladder. Some people are ahead, others behind. Some are more advanced, others less so. North Sentinel fits badly into that picture because it has not been passively left behind. It has actively declined the road. That does not make the island immune to history, but it does expose the arrogance hidden inside some ideas of progress. If a community can persist for generations without wanting the destination the modern world insists is universal, then perhaps that destination is not universally binding after all. One should also notice how much discipline this persistence required. From a distance, isolation can look like stillness. In reality, it is labor. Someone must watch the shore. Someone must teach the young how to read danger. Someone must maintain canoes, arrows, shelters, and routes through the forest. Someone must remember what outsiders bring. Someone must transmit enough social trust that the community does not splinter under fear or curiosity. To remain separate in a connected world is not passive. It is work repeated every generation. This makes the Sentinelese less mysterious in one sense and more impressive in another. The mystery remains because outsiders do not know their language, rituals, stories, or internal politics. But the broad shape of their achievement becomes easier to see. They created, or rather sustained, a social order in which the outside remained unnecessary enough to be refused and dangerous enough to be resisted. That is a remarkable balance. Many communities in history were destroyed because they could not avoid contact. Others survived, but only by entering dependent relations. North Sentinel endured by holding the line between both outcomes. Of course, no such endurance is guaranteed forever. The island remains vulnerable. Illegal fishing could bring new pathogens. Climate shifts could alter the ecology of a small island. A cyclone, a tsunami, or some unforeseen accident could cause severe damage. A future government might abandon restraint. Even without direct contact, isolation on a small island carries risks. The story of North Sentinel is not a triumphant ending in which a people has permanently escaped history. It is a present tense condition that must be respected continuously if it is to continue at all. That fragility may be why the island captures the imagination so strongly. We sense, perhaps without saying it directly, that North Sentinel represents something close to a final edge. If it were opened, the world would lose not just one more isolated population, but a living reminder that full global incorporation is not inevitable and not always good. The loss would be symbolic and human at once. It would erase a society's chosen distance and confirm one more time the modern habit of reaching wherever it can. The wiser response is not to turn the island into a museum of purity or a forbidden trophy of curiosity. It is to accept a very modest truth. The Sentinelese do not exist to teach the rest of us anything. They are not there as a philosophical demonstration, a spiritual challenge, an anthropological prize, or an adventure story. They are there because they are living their own lives, on their own island, in ways that have so far allowed them to continue as themselves. If we learn something from that, it should begin with restraint. And perhaps that is the quiet force of North Sentinel Island in the end. It reverses the usual direction of the lesson. The modern world often imagines itself as the teacher, bringing knowledge, truth, development, or salvation to those outside it. North Sentinel teaches by refusing the lesson altogether. It shows that there are circumstances in which the most ethical act is not outreach, not conversion, not rescue, not study, but leaving a people space to remain what they have chosen to remain. That does not solve every moral discomfort. It does not answer every question about vulnerability, population size, or future risk. It does not give historians the details they would love to know or satisfy the curiosity that the island so naturally provokes. But perhaps that dissatisfaction is part of the point. Modern humanity is accustomed to believing that every mystery exists to be penetrated. North Sentinel suggests that some mysteries are not there for us, some boundaries are real, some lives are not ours to enter. If so, then the island's long resistance is not only an old human survival story, it is one of the rare modern reminders that freedom can still take the form of refusal. Not the refusal of one policy or one government, but the refusal of incorporation itself. The refusal to be folded into a world that assumes it has the right to arrive everywhere. The refusal to let curiosity become possession. The refusal to let concern become control. And maybe that is why North Sentinel continues to feel so powerful in the imagination. Behind the reef, beyond the beach, inside the forest line that outsiders have never truly crossed, a small society has held on to something the larger world surrenders easily: the ability to say no and make it stand. For all the boats, maps, laws, cameras, arguments, and headlines, that may be the simplest answer to the question that brought us here. North Sentinel Island resisted the outside world for so long because the people on it built a life that made refusal possible, kept a memory that made refusal necessary, and defended a boundary that the outside world, for once, could not easily erase. And in that quiet, difficult endurance, they became something more than the last uncontacted society. They became one of the last places where humanity is still being reminded that not every door is meant to open.